I understand we have a class, so if people sort of want to identify who's in the class, and we'll find. Okay, great.
It's our clinical seminar.
It's a clinical seminar in the Somatics program,
yeah.
Right? Okay. And then others are ICP? Huh? Okay, EWP? Somatics. Okay, some more Somatics people.
I'm in the Bachelor Completion Program.
Okay, great.
I'm alumni.
Huh?
EXA alumni.
Oh, okay. Great.
And first semester ICP.
First semester ICP, okay. Good. Any other groups we're missing here? Integrated health. Integrated health. Okay, great. Well, welcome to everybody. It's nice to have a really broad mix of people. So, as introduced, I also do supervise for the Somatic program and for the mental health program, just so nobody feels left out. And sometimes I teach a group class out at State in the counseling department. So, just briefly, so you'll know where I come from. I sort of started out as a more psychodynamic person at the beginning of my career. I have a master's in social work and then a doctorate in counseling psychology. And I worked for the first few years mainly in that mode at Johns Hopkins Hospital, and then I moved to New Jersey and worked at the college, now the University of Dentistry and Medicine of New York. Hi, come on in, find a chair. And did emergency psych work primarily, and started to get training in family therapy. And so that was the sort of next 5 or 6 years of my work. So then I sort of was integrating those two things. And then I moved to San Francisco and started teaching at San Francisco State in the School of Social Work. And so I taught there for a number of years. And then about in the mid-90s, I got really interested in somatic work, partly because I'd taken up singing, and so I was sort of interested in the voice and what happens in taking breath and all that kind of work. And I was actually doing a little performance of something that I had commissioned for a teacher who had died. And my teacher, hi, come on in. My teacher at that time did some sort of support work of just putting a hand here for the performance. And it turned out he had been studying biodynamic psychotherapy. And so I got really interested in what that was about. And so, try to find one there. So that became something I studied along with a little Hakomi and then some work with Bill Nolan, psychophysical therapy. So I've done the 4 years of training of the somatic, of the biodynamic psychotherapy, which is a system really that's originated in Denmark that looks at the muscular system and the hyper and hypo pieces of the muscular system. And then I got again interested in the individual piece of attachment theory, because of course with all the sort of new brain research, attachment theory came back into sort of in a richer and deeper way. So those are sort of the strands that I've been doing. So now, as you said, I'm primarily a therapist in private practice, but also do teaching and doing supervision. So that's my sort of history or journey in the field of psychotherapy. One of the great things about it, I think, for those of you who are in the field, is that it is an ever-changing place, and there's a lot of always places for growth and new development. And that's one of the things I think that's kept me really interested in the work. So anyway, so what the piece I'm doing tonight is really around boundaries, and it comes from sort of a 2-day workshop that I do called Resource-Oriented Skills Training. And it's really to look at the mind-body connection, right-brain connection between sort of concepts around skills that one can use to help stay present. And that's really the basic thing that I'm sort of interested in, is how do we keep our sense of presence while we're doing anything, but particularly while we're being therapists, so that when a client's energy is rising or they're getting into a disassociated state, how is it that we can stay ourselves more present? And the 6 skills I look at in the workshop are grounding and centering and flexibility and boundaries and contact skills and orienting, so keeping oriented. So that's sort of the group of things that I work with. And so today we're going to take a look at boundaries. And the skills really help with a change between high stress and low stress in sessions. How many people are actually seeing clients? Okay, good. So you know what I'm talking about. We're going from low to high stress and back again. Is one of the things. Sort of coping with confusion and the unknown, and of course dealing with emotions. So for one thing, just sort of notice yourself and how present you are right now. To give yourself sort of a score on 1 to 100, how present would you say you were? And somebody just wants to, hi, come on in. Some chairs in the back if you can pull in, or space on the ground. Okay, find a chair there. I think there's one there that can be pulled in. Great. So anybody want to sort of give a number of 1 to 100, how present they're feeling?
I give about a 60.
60? Okay. Anybody else?
75.
75. All right. Anyone else have a number? 50. Okay. And then another group might take a look at what emotions are you bringing into the room. And this can be small amounts of emotion. So things like anger, sadness, shame, excitement, fear,
Anxiety.
sensuality. Huh?
Anxiety.
Anxiety, okay. Anything else people are noticing? Tired. Okay. Probably more body sensation than an emotion, but yeah.
Well, yeah.
Yes, but that sort of constellation of things, yeah.
Desire for information.
Okay.
Curiosity.
Curiosity, okay. Content? Full. And then what kind of body, people are sort of moving into the body sensations, so what body sensations do you bring in? Awareness of your body.
Tired.
Tired, yeah. Got a subgroup of tired. That's the end of the day. Yeah. Anything else?
My face sort of is orange and a little light.
Oh. Yeah.
Lightly heavy, but nice.
Okay.
A little bit weighted.
Good. And as you sort of hear people speaking, does that help you come a little more into the room, or make you go away? About the same? About the same?
Maybe another 5%.
Another 5%? Okay, great.
Where's it going? Where's it going?
More present or less present? More present, okay. Great. Anybody else? You were nodding your head?
Yeah.
More present?
More present.
More
yeah.
present, yeah. So it's one of the things that I try to do as I'm walking into a client is to really get a sense of how present am I. You know, so cognitively, how present am I, but also emotionally, what am I bringing into the room so that I can help distinguish that from what the client may be having in the room. And also somatically, how present am I? Am I aware of sort of what's happening in my body? Because in some way you're using your body as an instrument to read what's going on with the other person. So it's good to know what you're bringing into the room. And after a session, I also try to have some awareness of what I need to let go of from the client that I've just seen before, if I'm seeing another person, before I take on the next person. So again, there's sort of a reading for me of what am I bringing into the room. Am I still holding some of the sadness or anxiety from the person before me or not? And do I have a way of doing that? And I have different physical things that I can do if it needs to be that, or cognitive things if it's that, or writing something down so that I can clear that out of my system. So I think that's one of the important things, especially for the people who are somatic therapists, is knowing what you're bringing. Hi, come on in. Try that up. Okay. Hi.
Hi.
CP. we can let you agree some theory. Let me take this thing off. Okay, so, and again, just notice what it's like when new people come in, and let them get settled. Okay, so talking about boundaries. So we're talking about sort of two aspects when we're talking about boundaries. Part of it, I mean, it's about really being able to demonstrate the difference between me and the rest of the world, one aspect of boundaries. So there's an aspect about it that is about being able to fill up, so to be able to fill to your full capacity in some, whatever that means, and to be able to contain yourself and keep yourself together. And we all have strategies about how we hold ourselves together. And it can sometimes be very small if we feel, you know, we have to do a lot of containing, or it can be more expansive in other kinds of situations. And the other is about how to set boundaries to keep things out. So setting the limits on other people or other aspects of the environment. So there's actually both aspects of that. So you just to do a little bit of, you know, what's it like to set the boundaries out, to set a limit possibly on something. So just give it a shot with, you know, what's it like to use your hands to do that. And then also, what is it like to then to turn inward and to have a sense of filling up for yourself. And this is really, we're talking about the energetic boundary here. You can sort of notice whether there's something, one's more comfortable or more known than the others. Okay, any comments or things that you notice about that?
For me, when my hands were out, I just feel the energy going away from them, and while they're in, it's just like a big kind of cloud around me. Like, this is my space.
Mm-hmm.
I felt like I'm not used to doing pushing back, or I'm not supposed to do that.
You're not supposed to do that, to set the boundary out.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I can do this.
You can do this.
Maybe, yeah,
Yeah,
a little bit more.
but this one's a harder.
Yeah, like I feel guilty.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have the same thing, like it's really hard for me to, like I can find my place like here very easily, like, you know, playing with this give and take, but
Yeah.
like this play, I can't find my place. It feels really uncomfortable for some reason.
Okay.
And I wanted to add to that because I felt like a fullness this way and
Mhm.
emptiness that way.
Mm.
Like there's a place that I just couldn't find like perimeters or any kind of boundaries in a sense.
Yeah.
I feel like this actually made me realize that I'm like very defensive in my life, like walking around the street. It just made me feel how like taut and tense I am in this position, and then I'm fighting a lot. Like there's a lot of fight in this, and this felt really great and expansive, and I realized I don't do this very much.
I had similar, this felt nurturing.
Mm.
I felt like without using words and thinking about the words, I knew what I didn't want to be a part of or didn't want let in, and then when I did this, I had like I knew what I wanted to bring into me. So when I did it a couple times, it's like, oh, that's what I don't want, and oh, this is what I do want. And then I brought it closer to here, and I'm like, oh, this is where I do want it. And yeah, it helps.
Yeah. Yeah.
I quite liked this feeling. Kind of left me, you know, the first playing with this, I was like, yeah, how much space would I want to fill up? Like, maybe I want more. And then this is kind of like sort of defining, like, well, that I don't want in, then, but everything else I can feel pretty free.
Oh.
Or you just?
I was just, but that's okay.
Okay. Exploration is great.
No, I was just kind of contemplating what people are saying.
Yeah.
But I resonated most with Carla's comment about, first of all, I felt bad with this gesture because it felt like rejecting someone else, and I immediately went to, empathy towards the feeling of being rejected, and I didn't like the feeling of being the rejecter, so that was really uncomfortable. And then this one, I didn't find clarity in where my boundary was, but it was less uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm.
But I also spilled my almond milk all over my lap while you were talking. So I wasn't sure if I even was doing the same thing as everyone else in the room, frankly.
No, you weren't doing the same thing. Nobody else was spilling their milk. But you were expanding it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think this one I'm very accustomed to. And in this one, I felt very proud of being able to do this one because I remember when I didn't have good boundaries and really felt like, oh, I can do this one and I don't feel guilty about it or I don't feel shameful or bad. It feels good that I know where this is now.
Mm-hmm.
So that it was a nice reminder of some of the work that I've done.
Yeah.
Oh, getting more and more interesting. Okay, this this felt like a boundary, and it felt nourishing, like someone else like soothing. But when I went this way, I lost myself, and it didn't feel like I had much of a boundary. Even I knew I was pushing, I knew there was something, but I lost. It wasn't really very. It was very malleable, which I'm very familiar with.
Okay. Yeah.
I just had this cool thought because I was thinking of like the people that I work with, and it's just like this, and then they start to feel the same, and I'm like, oh, because I thought of like Superman shooting like lasers, like stay away. So I'm like, oh, they could be love lasers, like
Right.
I could feel the same as this. So like, yeah, it just depends on where your mind's at.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's so funny that you're doing this. I was thinking about doing this with a client, this very thing with a client today, and I couldn't bring myself to do it because I didn't know how to explain it. And this is, so I'm really happy that we're doing this because it's really helping me to kind of verbalize like how I might introduce this without it sounding too woo-woo.
Yeah.
But the thing I'm wondering about is, would you coach people on how to hold their hands, like especially if one feels more comfortable than the other? Like I'm noticing that if I do that, my natural inclination was to do this, but then if I just do this, then it feels a lot more comfortable.
Yeah.
Would you do that if you were working with somebody?
I might see how they feel, and then I might suggest they try other positions. I don't know. I think I wouldn't do an explanation or a direction at the first, just because it might limit what they might be interested in exploring.
Okay.
But I might, if they said something like, that doesn't feel so good, and I might say, well, would it be different if it was this way? So it's really, to encourage exploration, I think, is really always what one is trying to do, so, and maybe it's different if it's a little further apart. We'll do it a little later standing, and so you could see, is it different standing than sitting, because that has sort of a different feel to it. When you can move, it's also different. So I think that, it's always to try to give as many choices to people to see where, what is it, and how, what is it. Again, trying to put words to how is this different from this, because sort of thinking physically, you're using different muscles, and some people have more strength in some muscles than others. So sort of thinking from that sense of the somatic perspective is, this might be a little less, for some people, a little less energetic than, say, this, because this is a movement that we use more often. But maybe for other people, this has a more negative for some reason, because that got done to them as a kid, whereas this might not. This also has a little more playfulness possibly, because it's, sort of a peekaboo thing, So, people can have all kinds of associations. And that's one of the interesting things that can come out of it is, what are the associations and what do they mean and what do they link back to? Because all this early work, it starts when we're really young, obviously before we have a lot of cognitive skills. I mean, this kind of early boundary work, you're working on from really probably just pre-birth through the first year and a half. So, it's all very implicit. We don't have good, language at it at the beginning. It's that we have to put language to it later. So helping it become more language helps us be more aware of it. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, okay, so in the sort of bodynamic system, they talk about 4 levels of boundaries. So I'll just say, I'll try to put them up. But one is the physical boundary. So that's the skin. And I'll just go through and then we'll sort of come back. But the second is the energetic boundary, which we've been talking about. And this boundary, I mean, the skin boundary pretty much stays the same. It's pretty solid in that sense. The energetic boundary moves. So sort of think when you're on public transportation, people tend to hold that energy boundary usually pretty close. If you're lying out in the park with, a partner or a dog or, somebody, then you tend to have more space and often more open stuff. Depends on the park, I guess, in general. When you're out in nature or someplace. So the idea of that energetic boundary is a sort of a movable one. And it also has to do with, though not limited to, sort of protection of the heart and your sort of emotional energy, and also sort of your mental energy. And I think the sort of concept, I mean, one of the things that I think is interesting here is sort of the idea of how do we protect time. Our time, because time is a valuable commodity in some way. And I think it moves into sort of the roles and how do we deal with role time, which is a later stage. So the energetic, the physical boundary probably starts about 2 months before you're born. And it starts when you're having enough contact with your mother. So, and it often starts here in terms of, you start to feel it here first because of the way, you're in the womb. And sort of the fuller development of that goes on probably through the first year or 6 months, something like that. I mean, these are pretty vague kinds of things, but the energetic boundary, you get a more sense of once you're actually born. So it really comes from birth through the sort of the first year as you're learning what your energetic boundary is and how it separates from your parent or whoever your caregiver is. The third is the territorial boundary. And this boundary you start to work with when you can say something is mine. So the idea of my cup, my spoon, hi, come on, my place at the table, my bed, all have to do with territory. And often it's interesting to look around the room and see how have people defined their territory here.
I was noticing Krista.
Yes.
Some people have a lot of territory. Some people have their territory beside them, sometimes behind them. And how do you decide where your territory is and where's the territory of the person next to you?
Almond milk.
Huh?
There's some territory back there.
That's right. So find some
Not sure if I'm
territory
actually
there.
in the right territory.
This is the right territory.
It's about constellation?
No.
Constellation workshop?
No?
It's on the 5th floor.
Boundaries? Wrong place. Wrong territory. Thanks for dropping by. Okay, so to have a sense of the territory. This can be pretty culturally determined also, and by the family. So is the energetic boundary. Is often fairly culturally determined. What is too close or what is too far, or varies from culture to culture. But territory also, yeah.
Well, it's just funny because I teach yoga, and it's always an interesting thing to notice people's boundaries, because everyone's boundary is defined practically by the size of their yoga mat. But in a class when there's not a lot of people and they all spread out, then their boundaries are defined by the space around their yoga mat. But if there's a whole lot of people, then their boundaries are described
Right on them.
only by their yoga mat, but people get really territorial in a class like that. It's very interesting to see.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting in any meeting, any room that you're in with other people is to sort of see how people have defined that. You know? And how do people split the difference? You know, some people, you know, I mean, it's a very unconscious thing. I mean, we don't think about it. But, you know, there's sort of someplace there's a line where if I move something, it goes into somebody else's territory.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, or I want it closer to me because it's in somebody else's territory. I mean, it can have either sense about that.
So it seems like there might be some crossing over, the energetic and the territorial.
Yeah, sure. They all have some overlap with each other. Yeah.
So it's not just about like what objects are mine, it's about what space
What space is mine also.
Mine.
Yeah. Yeah. And that would be the overlap there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. We start to learn it, that piece of it though. I mean, there's a piece that's got to do with, you know, what is mine. And again, in every family, that's different. You know, there are lots of different things. I mean, there are boundaries about, you know, the territory is, you know, my journal, or who can come into the room and who can't come into my room, whatever my room is. You know, does somebody have to knock, or can they just come in? Do I have a chair at the table, or can anybody sit in any of the chairs? Same thing with, you know, external people. Can anybody come into the house, or is it restricted? You know, do you have to call before you come over, or can you just drop by? So, you know, it varies by neighborhood, it varies by, you know, there are a lot of different factors that go into that. And it's sometimes one of the big issues in couples work is when people have a very different sense about where the boundaries are and whose is what territory. You know, I mean, it's one of the big issues around money with couples is who does the money belong to? You know, if I earn it, is it mine? How do I share it? You know, I mean, that's one of the areas, but it's also around, you know, where my personal space is. Roommate situations, you know, often work with people around roommate situations, and, you know, territory is a huge issue there, because then you're sharing a lot of space, you know, kitchens, bedrooms, bathrooms, so that sort of has to do with the territorial, that set of boundaries. And then the fourth really sort of boundary is around role, which begins when kids are, you know, around force and they start to take on roles. So they want to be a fireman or a nurse or a police person, or you know, have a briefcase and go to work, whatever that means, you know.
A therapist.
Therapist, yeah, but not many 4-year-olds. Unless they've got parents. But then, so often with kids it has to do with the uniform, or the accoutrements, you know, the hose, something that attaches to it. But, you know, as you go on to different professions, again, you know, there are things around it. So what are the boundaries around, you know, particularly in this case, usually the therapist role? You know, what does that encompass? And you can sort of, the system-centered therapy group looks at what's the role, what's the goal, and what's the context. So that's one way of sort of breaking down, or, you know, what are the goals and what's the role. So you could have, within the idea of a therapist role, there might be, or at least within the context of your agency, say, you might have different roles. One might be a therapist role, one might be an advocate role. You know, if you work in the community, you might be serving in the kitchen kind of role, or distributing food. So, you know, there are different kinds of roles, but each of those would have some kind of a goal that's probably different from the others. But it helps define it, you know, and then there's sort of the management of how do I manage time, how do I manage money, and how do I set the boundaries around those so that they're comfortable for me and for the client and for the agency or, you know, clinic that you're working for. So all that has to do sort of with role boundaries. And again, you know, how is the role of therapist different from the role of friend? You know, so part of the work in a program like this, and, you know, in a graduate program, is helping to really flesh out and define how those roles are and how do I get comfortable in those roles. Because some people say sometimes it's hard to set boundaries, you know, to do this about saying, okay, the time is up. you know, or yes, you have to pay, you know, which are two of those, you know, and sort of how do you go back and forth so that the client also understands that, you know, there can be both of those. The other thing I think about, if you can depend on other people setting limits, is in some ways you can be closer, you know, in terms of relationship, because you're not having to worry about taking care of their boundaries as well as your own. So there's something really useful in being able to depend on, most of the time at least, another person being able to say what their boundaries are for things. I don't know if people have had that experience. Some people are nodding, but I don't know if
It
there's
makes
any-
sense.
Huh?
It makes sense.
Yeah, yeah. Because if I know you're going to say stop, then I don't have to wonder where is the stopping point. You know, have people done walking boundaries? I don't. Yeah, yeah. So when you can depend on the other person saying, here's where it's comfortable for me, then you don't have to, you know, because if you don't, if it's not clear, people start, there's a point where everybody will start stopping, even if the other person hasn't said it's time to stop, because they don't want to run into someone, you know. So, which is sort of the simple version, but the other version is, you know, it's good to know where the boundary is from that stance. But there is, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to
No.
say, I totally feel like that's a huge issue for me, of wanting to know that I can trust other people's boundaries so that I can be as big as I want to be in a given moment. Otherwise, I'm kind of keeping myself small. I don't know how small I have to be in order to leave them some space.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I'm constantly trying to gauge it. Can I be a little bit? Can I say more? Can I be more direct? Can I really say what I want? Or do I have to modulate it all the time?
Yeah, and I think that's a question clients have coming into therapy. You know, is how real can I be? You know, what would drive the other person away, or what would start to lose contact? You know, usually the big issue is, you know, what's going to cause me to lose contact with someone else that I'm trying to have contact with, which is sort of that question of how big can I be, and that can be a question you start in infancy, wondering, you know, in terms of your parent, how big can I be? And that I'm not going to lose contact by having them disappear on me because I'm too much, whatever that means, you know, in any given situation. So I think that's also a question when clients come in. And, you know, it's a question therapists have too. You know, it's how big can I be in the room? So let's stand up for a minute and just, that's an important thing to help people if they're having trouble negotiating those kinds of things, because often people are. Anybody else want to say anything?
Just that
Yeah.
we, Tiff and I, like actually lightly pushed against each other, and that felt surprisingly good. Like, just in my whole body, it just felt good to have something to push against and to have that be like solid.
Yeah.
Something
Yes,
I
and
don't-
that
I
could be
don't
another
do-
way of doing it, yeah.
Yeah, and I think that I just don't like do that very often in relationships.
When my partner came into my space with this boundary, I found it to be a lot easier than when she came in with this boundary. Yeah.
Different.
Yeah.
All the way around.
Yeah.
I found that when I was doing kind of I call it the hugging thing, but doing this, and my partner was like this, I wanted to step into her.
Oh.
I just had this urge to like go towards the energy that she was putting out.
And that can be an interesting situation with clients, if you feel drawn into the energy. You know, I mean, and again, it's sort of where do you and how do you negotiate boundary? So it's a I think it's one of the, you know, it's one of the important things when you're working with people too. That's always around the negotiation of the boundary. But it's not a singular thing. you know, and it varies during a session, between sessions, you know, so there's sort of always that piece. For people who do any kind of work with spacing chairs, you know, where do you find it safe, or the client feels the safest, you know, how far or how distant, you know, that can move during the session as well as between sessions.
It's interesting, as you say that
Yeah.
chairs are often in the same spot in most offices. And
Yeah.
it just occurred to me that bothers me.
Yeah, yeah. And sometimes they're heavy and big,
Right.
and they're really hard to move.
You can't
you know?
really move them exactly.
Yeah, they're hard to do something
It's
with.
interesting though. That,
Yeah, it's interesting when
fixed.
you ask people, you know,
Right.
what's the distance that would feel safe to you,
Right.
or best to you. You know,
Right.
doesn't have to necessarily use safe, but yeah.
It's probably the therapist who defines where their boundaries are comfortable, sets their furniture up that way.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's their territory.
Yeah. Yeah. And so in some way it becomes a question of how shared can you make that?
Right.
You know, how willing are you to have some shared territory
Right.
with the client? Yeah. And can you set your space up? I mean, you know, sometimes it's not your space, but it's somebody else's space, so you
Right.
have less choice
Right.
about that. But
Well, there's literal space and then psychological space.
and there's psychological space, yeah.
So figuring it out.
Yeah.
It's interesting, really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, some people use pillows. You know, if you're in a space where you can put pillows between you, that gives a sense of space. You know, a different kind of sense than just open space between people. So there's a lot of ways of negotiating that. Even, you know, a towel or something draped across the ground can give you the sense of some kind of space.
Or just turning your body
Yes, turning your body
away from the person a
Yeah.
little bit.
Yeah, sometimes I don't know if people have done string boundaries, but you know, where you use string. And I often have clients do that when they're calling people that they have a hard time talking to on the phone. You know, is that they use the string boundary, you know, often with family members, you know, that, you know, how to keep some sense of their space from being invaded. So it can be tiny in terms of the actual physical matter, but it, you know, it has the sense of the psychological matter. So, and I think, you know, the other really important thing about boundaries in terms of working with trauma, you know, is sort of to apply this, is that almost by, I mean, I think by definition, trauma involves the breaking of some boundaries, of some, either one or more boundaries. And I think sometimes the work is, you know, not repairing the most obvious boundaries, but some of the ones that you might not think about. So for some people, you know, the loss of territory, even when there's nothing else going on, you know, a car is stolen, you know, something's stolen, but you're not even present, can still have a huge impact on people, not only for the value of it, but for the sense of territory being invaded. And so, you know, how do you help a person reestablish their boundary around territory? You know, if there's something like physical or sexual abuse, you've got the potential of, I mean, you do have all the boundaries violated. I mean, you have the physical boundary, you have the energetic boundary. Usually, I mean, it's going to be the territory as well. And depending on who it is, you're also going to have the potential of a role boundary. So if it's a person who's supposed to be protecting you and keeping you safe, but they're not, there's also that violation of role boundary. Surgery, you know, has at least the energetic and the physical boundary that get reached. In this area, it's always useful to talk about earthquakes because their energetic boundary, at least, often the physical boundary, depending on if there's some kind of injury or fright because of your safety. Often the territory if there's something damaged. Sometimes the role in terms of how one reacts in an emergent kind of situation. You know, you can have the expectation you should behave in a certain way, but you know, instinctual drive takes over for safety, and that you're not always doing the thing that you think you would do in an emergency. You know? So it's about really working with each of those, and I think also working with the emotion of shame, because also with the breach of boundary, there's something about not having been able to protect safety of ourselves in whatever context that is. I mean, sometimes we're too small, sometimes we don't have enough power, but even to be able to share the sense of the shame about not being able to protect our safety in some kind of way is, I think, a really important aspect of working through boundary violations with people. So we're sort of getting near the end, but yeah.
Well, let's say boundaries with children is really good.
Yes.
A lot of us in this class
Are working with kids. Yeah.
And especially the role boundary, I think. For me, I find most difficult when I have to, when somebody needs to go to the bathroom, automatically I have to, walk them, and I'm thinking, okay, I'm just walking this kid to the bathroom, yet, and I'm, we're taking care of basic needs.
Yeah.
Yet, is this part of my role? Is this is it part of my role to give them a snack if they're hungry? It's kind of like that. So how do you negotiate that? The touch, the territory. It's all about playing with them. So
yeah, and how much touch and how much not. Yeah, and it depends on the age usually, and what the rules of the place are. And also how you keep safe.
Oh,
in terms of that, yeah.
For sure. Yeah, and how much energy we take on.
Right. Yeah. So questions or other comments or observations?
I guess I'm thinking of we're kind of we're just representing boundary by the arms. And it is boundary, and it's also extension of heart, which I appreciate. And then that brings me to what I was like, really, do I not have a boundary? That's not true. I know. I have a very internal line of my boundary. Like someone could come in really close, and I hold a boundary, and I actually feel like in my own therapy I work on that for intimacy reasons. All my boundaries really deep. So I I guess I kind of want to honor the range of that. It's not just outside of our bodies, but there's some other, and the access of that is something I'm curious about. Please come back to give us an advanced
Thank you.
boundary workshop. Because it's just the violations therefore can be quite deep and unseen, and whether this exercise for a client who has been violated that deep, I'm just not sure what would happen. Is it going to access it? Is it good to have distance, or how to bring it in and into the core would just be something I'd be curious about.
Yeah, and I think to do that, for myself, I would work first with helping somebody really be able to get centered and grounded, so that they had some other skills and to keep oriented. So the whole idea of being able to be present in the room, because then it helps them not go back into whatever the trauma might have been. I think another principle that at least in the body dynamics is really key is to think about how big a dose of something that you're doing. So that if you're doing something like that, you would start very small and sort of see how much movement there can be. And also you might be working with breath. Do people quit breathing in some way as they try to bring it out in any kind of way, or as they come in towards it? So, and it might be something that moves back and forth in that sense, to see what kind of flexibility there is. But doing something really small would certainly be a key to that, when there's deep moving that's happening. Because anything fast is going to be a little overwhelmed. And so rather, more than being out here, you might want to really be close in terms of seeing if that's a place that people even can come to, or really even coming. You might be working on a muscular level of just, can it come to the front of the muscles, or if you're on the spine, can it go both front and back of the spine in terms of having energy come out. So yeah. But really small is beautiful in this group. Any comments or questions or surprises or learnings? So is there anything that surprised you or things that you learned?
Yeah. The thing I liked about it, what we did was I got some more language to talk about, like I was saying earlier, about how to talk about it. But the thing is, I'm thinking about my client that I wanted to do this with today, and she's just not in a place that's what I'm sitting with right now.
Yeah. One way I sometimes do it, but it's because I've got a family background, is to ask I might ask what kind of boundaries did they have in the house? And then I'm sort of interested in doors and walls and the sort of the thing. I mean, I might go to territory. Did she have, how did it work in her family that people had their own space, or did they? Could she shut a door and have it not be opened by someone, or could people come in or out? I mean, you start to get some sense of what the boundaries were like, and her experience of, did she ever get a chance to have a boundary, within the family? And then sort of just being curious about what was that like, either to have it or not have it, and would she have wanted more or less of it, without having a judgment about it. That might be a way that she could start to work with it. Or even her current living situation, how does that work? How do people separate? I don't know, if that would be something that would work with her. But
that would be a good
sometimes with something really tangible.
Okay.
Yeah. Because then you're not into the energetic, if that's not a language that she's used to.
Okay.
Yeah. Sports is sometimes a really good metaphor. I like using sports if people have any kind of sport that they participate in, or, dance, or, any kind of martial arts, or weight work, in a gym, because then people usually, there's some language often around that. I was working with someone, and I was having a really hard time with centering, the whole notion of centering. But then he started, and I asked about sport, and he skis. So all of a sudden, I could say, so what's it like when you're skiing? Yeah, he knew what that meant then.
Oh, okay.
Because that's how he was able to have control over coming down the mountain. So it's also then sometimes finding where's another place in their life that they might have had experience that you can translate it for.
Okay.
And he said, I never thought about bringing that into any other part of my life, because it's sort of relegated to sport, outside. But,
Thank you.
yeah. Did you have a,
I was wondering if you noticed a correlation between not having good boundaries and transference, or have you found it useful when people are able to?
Well, that's interesting.
Or
I think in terms of helping to manage it, I don't know that having good boundaries necessarily stops. I don't know that you want to stop it. So,
Right.
But I think as you're hearing it from a client, having your own good boundaries around it helps you be able to listen and respond to it.
Right.
Yeah.
What I'm wondering is if a person can easily become merged with therapist or someone, and then, or not even, it can be very subtle, and then I can, I'll take the example, I'm the client, and then I can project my inner critic, super ego, whatever, things like that, because I don't have a sense of subject-object, separation.
Yeah. Yeah. Then that's the work. And what's helpful is if the therapist can then have boundaries, so that they don't react with countertransference. That's, injurious to the relationship. And they can also have a sense of whether it's, that it's not personal in some sense. That's, in some way, depending on what kind of therapy you're doing, that could, that's sort of an expectation or part of the role. So when you're thinking about the role boundaries, is, how do you respond when a client has transference to you in whatever ways? And what's your own countertransference back, if that's happening? Which is often a discussion of supervision and training and classes. So, yeah. Because it's not, it's not something we're sort of born knowing how to deal with. I know we have to be out of the room, I think, at 7:30. So. Anyway, thank you very much.
Thank you.